The contract sat on the mahogany desk like a verdict waiting to be signed. Grace Donnelly stared at the pages, black ink on cream paper legal language that translated 3 months of pain into $500,000 in public accountability. Her lawyer, Patricia Wu, sat across from her in the downtown Chicago office, 52 floors above the city that had watched Grace kneel and done nothing. "This is what we fought for," Patricia said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of 3 weeks of brutal negotiations. "You don't have to destroy them to win." Grace's fingers traced the signature line. The pen Patricia offered probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent at the studio apartment she was about to leave. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan stretched gray and endless under March clouds. Somewhere down there, the Velvet Rose was opening for lunch service. New management, new policies, new staff who would never know her name unless they Googled the restaurant's history. 3 weeks since her video went viral. 3 weeks since 70 witnesses found their voices too late. 3 weeks since she'd knelt on broken glass while 3 men laughed and her brother showed her what real power looked like when it chose gentleness over violence. "They'll publish the apologies Friday," Patricia continued. "Full page in the Tribune and Wall Street Journal. Your words, their signatures, no hedging, no qualifications." Grace picked up the pen, expensive weight, cold metal, the instrument that would close this chapter and open another. But first she needed to remember, needed to honor the woman who'd knelt so the woman who sat in this office could stand. "Let me take you back," Grace thought as the pen touched paper, "to the night that changed everything." The Velvet Rose occupied the kind of Chicago real estate that announced wealth before you even walked through the doors. Marble steps worn smooth by expensive shoes. Brass railings polished to mirror brightness. Windows tinted just enough to suggest that secrets lived inside the kind powerful people paid good money to keep. The lounge sat on the 40th floor of the Sinclair building, offering views of Lake Michigan that cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. Grace had been working there for 3 months, 12-hour shifts that left her feet aching and her soul exhausted. She was 26, orphaned at 7, raised in Chicago's foster care system alongside her older brother Dominic, until he aged out at 18 and she stayed behind for 10 more years. Community college degree earned in stolen hours between double shifts. Student loans that had ballooned from $40,000 to $85,000 thanks to interest rates that felt designed to keep people like her underwater forever. She had a younger foster sister, Hazel, 16 and brilliant and headed to college if Grace could just keep the money coming. Hazel deserved better than the system that had raised them both. Grace was determined to give her that. The Velvet Rose paid well enough to cover Hazel's SAT prep course and application fees and the dream of a future that didn't include poverty. So Grace smiled through the exhaustion, memorized drink orders and dietary restrictions and the hierarchies that determined which tables got the best service. She learned to be present but unseen, to anticipate needs while remaining perpetually out of frame. She learned the 3 rules on her first day. Mr. Pemberton, the floor manager, delivered them with bored efficiency. Rule 1, the customer is always right. Even when they're wrong, especially when they're wrong, they're right. Your job is to make them feel right. Rule 2, don't talk back. Not to defend yourself, not to correct a mistake that isn't yours. Not ever. Rule 3, if something breaks, you pay for it. Glasses, plates, dignity. Itemized and deducted from your paycheck. Questions. Grace had swallowed every question. She needed this job too badly to risk losing it over something as useless as pride. Her only friend at the Velvet Rose was Julian Hayes, the bartender. 28 English degree from Northwestern that turned out to be worth approximately nothing in the current job market. Dark hair always slightly too long and eyes that noticed everything. Julian had warned her about the Friday regulars during her first week. Those 3 he'd said one night, tilting his head toward a corner booth. "Be careful with them." Grace had looked. 3 men in expensive suits laughing too loud at jokes that probably weren't funny. They looked like every other customer at the Velvet Rose, well-groomed, well-dressed, the casual confidence that came from never worrying about rent or medical bills. Why Grace had asked, Julian wiped down the bar with more force than necessary. Just trust me. Keep your distance when you can. But distance was a luxury Grace couldn't afford. The three men always requested her section. They always came on Fridays, and they always made sure she knew exactly how much power they had and how little she did. Thaddeus Blackwood, 32, real estate executive, old money wrapped in new ambition. Forearm tattoo from his prep school rowing team that he made sure stayed visible when he rolled his sleeves. He wore cruelty-like cologne, not trying to hide it, just letting it announce his presence. Montgomery Ashford orbited around Thad like a moon around a planet, stocky rings on every finger, investment banker with a laugh that made you want to leave the room. Preston Vale completed the trio. Lean, cruel smile hedge fund manager who would tip generously then ask for it back just to watch you flinch. They'd started subtle. Week 1 had been innuendo disguised as compliments. Grace smiled and ignored them the way she'd been trained to ignore everything uncomfortable. Week 2 brought touching, hands brushing against hers when she set down drinks, Thad positioning himself so she had to reach across him to clear the table. Week 3 was when they discovered they could make her crouch. "Could you get that?" Thad had said, gesturing to a napkin he'd knocked to the floor. Grace had bent down to retrieve it. When she stood, all three were staring with expressions that made her skin crawl. Preston had his phone out filming her. That's when Grace realized the harassment wasn't random. It was escalating, testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before she pushed back. And she couldn't push back. She needed this job, needed to prove to herself and to Dominic and to everyone who'd ever doubted her that she could survive on her own terms. Her brother. The thought made her chest tight with love and resentment and shame. Dominic Donnelly, 8 years older, the only constant in a childhood defined by instability and foster homes and caseworkers who cycled through their lives like seasons. Dom had aged out of the system at 18 and immediately started building something Grace didn't fully understand, but knew was dangerous. Import-export, he called it. Business opportunities that required discretion and cash, and an understanding that some questions were better left unasked. By the time Grace was 16, Dominic had money. Real money. Enough to get her out of the worst foster homes, enough to pay for college classes, enough to solve every problem Grace mentioned and some she hadn't. She loved him for it. God, she loved him. He'd been her protector since she was 4 and he was 12, stealing food to make sure she didn't go to bed hungry, lying to caseworkers about bruises, promising her that someday he'd be big enough that nobody could hurt them again. But loving Dominic came with a cost. Everyone knew her as Dominic Donnelly's sister. Professors gave her speculative looks. Hiring managers paused when they saw her last name. Grace was tired of being an extension of her brother's shadow. 6 months ago, she'd told him she needed space. The argument had been brutal. "Let me help you," Dominic had said, standing in his brownstone with its hardwood floors and expensive art. "I'm not your responsibility anymore," Grace had replied. "I need to prove I can make it myself. Pride isn't worth dying for, maybe not, but it's worth living for." She'd left that night, moved into a studio apartment that made Dominic anxious, started working at the Velvet Rose, stopped answering his calls as often, built a wall between them made of stubbornness and love, and the desperate need to be her own person. She'd only met his daughter Violet twice since the little girl's mother died 2 years ago in violence. Dominic never fully explained. 4 years old and already carrying grief too heavy for small shoulders. Grace had wanted to help, to be the Aunt Violet needed, but that would mean stepping back into Dominic's world. Accepting his protection, admitting she couldn't survive alone. So she'd stayed away, proven nothing except that pride made a poor substitute for family. She'd been doing fine. Really, the job was manageable. The harassment was something she could endure, just like she'd endured foster care and poverty and every other indignity life had thrown at her. Until the night they made her kneel. Week 12 started like any other Friday. Grace arrived at the Velvet Rose at 5:30, 30 minutes before her shift, changed into her uniform in the staff bathroom. Black dress professional but fitted in a way that maximized tips. Black stockings, sensible heels, hair pulled back in a style that looked effortless but took 20 minutes. Julian was already behind the bar polishing glasses that didn't need polishing. "They're already here," he said without looking up. Grace's stomach dropped. The three men. It was barely 6 o'clock. They usually didn't arrive until 8. Early start to the weekend, I guess. Julian's jaw was tight. "Grace, if they get too bad tonight, tell Pemberton you're sick. Go home and lose a Friday night's tips." Grace forced a smile. "I've handled them for 11 weeks. I can handle one more." Julian finally looked at her. There was fear in his expression, real fear. What Grace asked, nothing. "Just be careful. Those three, they're connected. I've seen their boss here before. Big guy, expensive suit, the way Pemberton acts when he's around." He trailed off. "Just be careful." The evening started smooth. Grace worked her section with practiced efficiency. Businesswomen celebrating a promotion. An older couple who left precisely 20%. A young man proposing to his girlfriend, and Grace felt her throat tighten. Watching the girlfriend say yes because some people got happy endings and some people just got Friday night shifts. Thad and his friends were on their 4th round by 9 o'clock. Grace had been managing them carefully, keeping visits brief, smile, professional body language closed. But the energy was shifting. Laughter getting louder, comments getting cruder. Preston had his phone out, pointing it at her. The ambient music was soft jazz, the lighting warm and amber. 70-plus customers filled the lounge, everyone watching without watching, eyes tracking situations while maintaining plausible deniability. 9:45. Thad raised a hand, snapping his fingers twice. Sharp sounds that cut through conversation, summoning her like a dog. Grace approached, tray balanced. "Ready. This drink is warm," Thad said. He hadn't touched it. "The complaint was manufactured. I'll get you a fresh one immediately," Grace said. Voice steady. Professional. "No." Thad leaned back. His smile was terrible. "I think you should fix it properly. I'm not sure I understand. Get on your knees." This time loud enough that nearby tables could hear. "Fix it like you mean it." The lounge went quiet. Conversation dying in a 20-foot radius. "I'll get you a new drink right away, sir." "I don't want a new drink." Thad's voice was conversational now. Reasonable, making her refusal seem unreasonable. "I want you to kneel. Show some respect." Montgomery laughed. Preston raised his phone higher. Grace looked around. 70 witnesses. Mr. Pemberton near the hostess station watching. A businesswoman frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips. An elderly couple, the Whitakers, staring at their dessert like it had suddenly become fascinating. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody helped. Grace made a decision. She would crouch. Not kneel, but crouch beside the table low enough to technically comply while keeping some dignity. She could endure this. 6 more hours and she'd never have to see these men again. She started to bend her knees, carefully maintaining balance with the tray. That's when Thad's foot moved. Not a nudge, a shove. Hard against the back of her knee. Grace went down. The tray flew. Glasses exploded against polished wood. Whiskey and gin spreading like spilled blood. Ice skittering. Crystal shards glittering in amber light. She landed on her knees, right in the center of broken glass. The impact knocked air from her lungs. She felt sharp edges cutting through stockings, biting into skin. Felt liquid soaking through her dress. Felt warmth running down her shins that might have been whiskey or blood. The lounge went absolutely silent. Grace knelt there, hands finding the floor, palms pressing into glass and liquid, dark curls falling across her face like a curtain she desperately wished would hide her. Tears came before she could stop them, hot and shameful. She hated herself for crying, hated them for making her, hated the room full of witnesses. "Look at that," Montgomery said. "She's crying. Pathetic." "Should have been more careful," Preston added. "Still filming." Thad crouched down, not kneeling, just lowering himself to make sure she could see his face. "Maybe hospitality isn't your calling," he said, loud enough to perform. His friends laughed. Tables stayed silent. Grace could feel eyes on her back. 70 witnesses who could have said something, done something, demanded these men leave, but intervening would mean causing a scene. Witnesses were safer. She pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to hold back the sob. Failed. The sound was small and broken. Near the bar, Julian gripped the counter, knuckles white. Mr. Pemberton stood frozen, calculating whether intervention would cost more than cents. The Whitakers looked at each other with matching shame, stood together, dropped bills on their table, left without asking for their check. Walking past Grace, close enough to help, far enough to pretend they hadn't seen, Thad nudged a larger piece of glass toward her with his polished shoe. "Clean it up properly this time." Grace's fingers trembled as she reached for the glass. Edges cut into her skin, but physical pain was nothing compared to the weight of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. She was so focused on surviving the next 60 seconds that she didn't notice when the atmosphere changed. But everyone else did. The temperature dropped. The air grew heavy, the jazz cut off mid-phrase. Conversations died. Glasses stopped moving. Breathing seemed to pause. Julian went absolutely still, his eyes fixed on something behind Grace. The businesswoman set down her wine with a shaking hand. Mr. Pemberton stood straighter, face going pale. The entrance door had opened. Dominic Donnelly stepped inside. He moved with a calm that made your stomach drop. Dark coat hanging open over a pressed shirt, hands relaxed at his sides, face carved from discipline and control, tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in the way dangerous things often are. Sharp jawline, dark eyes that missed nothing. But it wasn't his appearance that commanded the room. It was his presence, that quiet, inevitable authority that bent the air. He'd been here before. Not often, but enough that staff recognized him. Enough that regulars knew his name. Dominic Donnelly didn't need to announce himself. 20 feet away, Grace knelt on broken glass, unaware her world was about to shift. Dominic's eyes found her immediately. His sister, his blood, his responsibility. He saw the tears, the trembling hands, the 3 men standing over her. His expression didn't change. That was worse than anger. What moved across his face was cold mathematics, the precise calculation of consequences these men had earned. He took one step forward, then another. Footsteps silent, coat moving with each stride. Customers recognized him. Some had seen him before, others knew him by reputation. All understood what his presence meant. Julian dropped a glass behind the bar. The sound shattered silence like a gunshot. Thad and his friends continued laughing, oblivious, too focused on Grace to notice the room's transformation. Dominic crossed half the distance, then 3/4. Grace finally looked up, tears wet on her cheeks, blood mixing with whiskey on her stockings. And she saw him. Their eyes met. Grace didn't call out, didn't need to. The recognition was instant, relief and shame and love and fear compressed into one moment. Dominic stopped 5 feet behind the 3 men, close enough to hear their laughter, close enough to see exactly how they'd positioned themselves around his sister. He waited, patient, letting the moment breathe, letting witnesses remember. The businesswoman put her hand over her mouth. The young engaged couple stood slowly. Mr. Pemberton looked sick. Dominic took one more step, 3 feet behind Thad, close enough that his shadow fell across the broken glass. Thad was still talking, still performing. Telling Grace how she needed to learn her place, Dominic spoke 2 words. Quiet enough that only the men immediately around him could hear. But those 2 words changed everything. Step away. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Step away. 2 words. Quiet as a whisper. Absolute as gravity. Thaddeus Blackwood turned slowly. His smile faltered before his eyes focused. Some primitive part of his brain recognized danger first. When Thad's gaze landed on Dominic Donnelly, blood drained from his face so quickly he swayed. Recognition took 3 seconds. Thad's eyes moving from Dominic's face to his coat to his hands to his stance. Processing, understanding flooding in like ice water. "Oh," Thad said, voice barely audible, then again quieter. "Oh, God." Montgomery had turned too. His laugh died mid-sound, choked off. Rings caught light as his hands trembled. Preston lowered his phone slowly, face going slack with fear or the sudden understanding that he'd miscalculated badly. Dominic said nothing, didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there and stared at Thaddeus Blackwood with eyes gone absolutely cold. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, the entire lounge holding its breath. Then Dominic's gaze shifted, dropped to Grace, still on her knees, surrounded by glass, blood seeping through torn stockings. Something flickered across his face, not rage. Rage would have been hot and merciful. This was colder. The kind of anger that didn't explode but calcified into permanent consequence. Thad stumbled backward 1 step, then another, shoes slipping on whiskey-wet floor. Montgomery moved sideways, putting distance between himself and Grace. Preston raised his hands slowly, palms out, universal surrender. 3 seconds. That's how long it took for their power structure to collapse. Dominic didn't follow. Didn't need to. He just stood there watching them scramble, filing away every detail for later. Every flinch. Every dropped gaze. Around the room, 70 witnesses remained frozen. But something had shifted. The businesswoman was crying silently, mascara running. The engaged couple held each other. Mr. Pemberton had gone gray. Julian remained behind the bar, knuckles white, watching Dominic the way you'd watch a storm approaching. Dominic finally moved, walked past the 3 men like they were furniture. Irrelevant. He approached Grace with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone his size. Grace looked up as he knelt beside her. Up close, Dominic was even more imposing. Broad shoulders, muscled forearms. But his face held her attention. The sharp jawline from childhood. The dark eyes that had watched over her through foster homes and bad boyfriends and late nights when the world felt too heavy. He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, gently pushed her curls back from her face. His fingers were careful, tender. The same hands that had built a reputation for delivering pain now wiping tears from his sister's cheeks. "You weren't supposed to see me like this," Grace whispered. Dominic's jaw tightened. "I see you exactly as you are, Gracie. Strong enough to survive this, brave enough to still be kind." He looked at her knees, saw glass embedded in skin, blood seeping through stockings. The way she'd been kneeling while 3 men laughed and 70 people watched. "Let me see," he said quietly. Grace shifted. Dominic's expression went very still as he assessed the damage. Not just physical wounds, but the violation of it, the deliberateness, the performance of cruelty for an audience that chose entertainment over intervention. He looked up, not at the 3 men, at the bartender, Julian. Dominic's voice wasn't loud, didn't need to be. "First aid kit, now!" Julian moved faster than Grace had ever seen, nearly knocked over bottles, reaching the kit beneath the register, brought it to Dominic personally, hands shaking. "Thank you," Dominic said, polite as Sunday dinner. Julian retreated, but not before catching Grace's eye. The apology in his expression was crushing. Dominic opened the kit with practiced efficiency, pulled out antiseptic wipes, gauze, tweezers, set them in a neat line. Then looked at Grace with an expression that asked permission. She nodded, too exhausted to speak, too grateful to resist. He began removing glass from her knees. Each piece came out clean, carefully extracted and dropped into a napkin Mr. Pemberton had nervously provided. The manager hovered nearby, uncertain, sweating through his expensive shirt. Dominic worked in silence, focused entirely on his sister. The rest of the room temporarily forgotten. This was the image that would burn into every witness's memory. Dominic Donnelly, one of Chicago's most feared figures, kneeling on the floor, carefully tending his sister's wounds with hands that could break bones but chose to heal. The businesswoman had her phone out, not filming, just clutching it. The engaged couple couldn't look away. Even staff seemed shaken by the intimacy, the contrast between reputation and reality. Behind them, Thad and his friends remained frozen, unsure if they were allowed to leave, terrified to stay. Dominic cleaned Grace's knees with antiseptic. The sting made her hiss, but he didn't pause. Just worked with the same methodical care he'd shown when she was 9 and had fallen off her bike, and he'd been 17 and already learning that gentleness was a choice, not a weakness. When the wounds were clean, he wrapped them in gauze. Not too tight, not too loose. Perfect pressure. He'd done this before. Field medicine. The kind you learned when hospitals asked too many questions. Finished, he helped her stand, one hand under her elbow, the other supporting her back, steadied her until he was certain she could hold her own weight. Only then did he turn around. The temperature plummeted. Dominic's expression shifted from gentle concern to something carved from ice. He looked at the 3 men the way you might look at a stain that needed removing. Thad opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Look, we didn't know she was." Dominic raised one hand. "Palm out. Stop." Thad's mouth snapped shut, teeth clicking. "You don't apologize to me," Dominic said, each word precisely articulated. "You don't explain to me. You don't speak to me at all." He took one step forward. The 3 men stepped back. "You humiliated my sister, made her kneel on broken glass, recorded it, laughed about it in front of 70 witnesses, another step forward, another step back from them. So here's what happens next." Dominic paused. "You're going to leave. You're going to walk out of here with whatever dignity you think you have left, and you're going to spend the rest of your lives remembering this moment." Thad's face had gone gray. "We're sorry. We didn't mean to. I said you don't speak to me." He turned slightly, addressing the room, making sure every witness heard. "These 3 men," he gestured without looking at them, "are no longer welcome in the Velvet Rose. Not tonight. Not ever. Anyone who serves them, anyone who accommodates them, anyone who pretends they're acceptable company." He paused. "You answer to me personally." Silence, absolute and terrified. Dominic looked at Mr. Pemberton. "Am I understood?" The manager nodded so hard his glasses slipped. "Yes, sir. Completely understood." "Good." Dominic turned back to the 3 men. "Leave. Now!" They ran, not literally sprinting, but their exit carried unmistakable energy of flight. Thad's shoulder hit the doorframe. Montgomery forgot his coat. Preston looked back, once caught Dominic's eyes still tracking him, and moved faster. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than a slam. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. 70 witnesses frozen in aftermath, afraid that breathing too loudly might remind Dominic Donnelly they'd watched his sister kneel and done nothing. Then Dominic turned back to Grace. The transformation was immediate. Ice melted from his expression, replaced by concern so raw it felt intrusive to witness. He reached for her again, checking the gauze, making sure wrapping was secure, that no glass remained. "Does it hurt?" he asked quietly. Grace shook her head. They both knew she was lying. Dominic didn't call her on it. Instead, he shrugged out of his dark coat, expensive fabric, perfectly tailored. Draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her smaller frame, hung past her hips. But it was warm and smelled like safety, like expensive cologne, and underneath all of that, the scent that was just him, just her brother, who'd been keeping her safe since before she could remember. Grace pulled the coat tighter. "Thank you," she whispered. Dominic's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have to thank me for this." "I know, but I am anyway." He studied her face, really looked at her for the first time, saw exhaustion beneath tears, the weight of 3 months enduring, the strength it took to kneel on glass without screaming. "You're stronger than you think," Dominic said. "I don't feel strong. Strength isn't feeling strong." He tucked a curl behind her ear. "It's surviving when you don't feel strong at all." The sedan was waiting at the curb. Black, expensive. Windows tinted dark. The driver, Vincent, stood by the rear door. Tall, silent, the kind of man who'd seen enough violence to recognize when it was about to happen. He opened the door. Grace slid into leather interior, Dominic's coat still wrapped around her. Dominic followed, and Vincent closed them into quiet darkness. The car pulled away smoothly, Chicago lights sliding past windows. Grace pressed her forehead against cool glass and watched the city blur. Her knees throbbed. Her hands shook with delayed reaction. She wanted to cry again, but had used up all her tears. Dominic said nothing, just sat beside her in darkness, giving her space to process, to breathe, to exist without having to perform anything except what she actually felt. 3 blocks passed before Grace spoke. "You didn't hurt them." It wasn't a question, just observation, confusion threading through her voice. "No," Dominic said. "Why not?" "Because some punishments last longer than bruises." Grace absorbed this, turned it over in her mind. She'd grown up watching Dominic operate, watching him build influence through carefully orchestrated consequences rather than immediate violence. Their father had been the opposite, all rage and fists. Dominic had learned young that fear based on anticipation was more effective than fear based on memory. "What happens to them now?" Grace asked quietly. Dominic pulled out his phone, sleek device that looked ordinary but Grace knew was anything but. He tapped the screen, then began making calls. The first was to someone named Marcus. "It's me," Dominic said when the call connected. "I need you to look into 3 men." He rattled off names: Thaddeus Blackwood, Montgomery Ashford, Preston Vale. Physical descriptions. The fact they'd been at the Velvet Rose tonight. Full backgrounds, employment, business licenses, professional associations, financial exposure, anything that gives them standing. "I want to know where they're vulnerable." A pause while he listened. "No, nothing illegal. I just want information. By morning." He ended the call and immediately dialed another number. This time a woman answered. Crisp voice, papers shuffling. "Elena, I need a favor. Whatever you need." 3 men assaulted someone under my protection tonight at the Velvet Rose. I want it known they're no longer welcome in any establishment where I have influence. The usual list, expanded list. Every restaurant, club, lounge, and bar in the city that values my patronage. They get turned away at the door, politely, professionally, but absolutely consider it done. Permanent or temporary? Dominic glanced at Grace. Permanent, until I say otherwise. Understood. I'll have it circulated within the hour. The call ended. Dominic made 3 more in rapid succession, each conversation brief, professional, devastating in its efficiency. By the time the 4th call ended, Thad, Montgomery, and Preston had been effectively exiled from Chicago's social infrastructure, not through violence, not through overt threat, just through quiet withdrawal of access that made a city navigable for men like them. Grace watched her brother work, part awed, part uncomfortable. This was Dominic's world, where power moved through phone calls, where consequences accumulated silently until they became inescapable. "You're scaring me a little," she admitted. Dominic lowered his phone, looked at her directly. "Good, good. Not because I want you afraid of me, because I want you to understand you're never as alone as you feel." "I didn't ask for this," Grace said. "I know." Dominic's voice was gentle. "You never ask. That's the problem." He shifted to face her more fully. "Gracie, you've been working at that place for 3 months. 3 months of coming home exhausted, of dodging my calls, of pretending everything was fine when I could hear in your voice that it wasn't. I was handling it. You were enduring it. There's a difference." Grace felt tears threatening again, frustration and gratitude and exhaustion mixing. "I wanted to prove I could survive without you." Dominic was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard all night. Why the question was simple, the answer complicated. Grace looked out the window, searching for words. "Because everyone in my life knows I'm Dominic Donnelly's sister. At school, in job interviews, at the Velvet Rose. It's always there. This weight, this expectation. I wanted something that was mine. Something I earned without your shadow." The brownstone came into view. 3 stories of old brick and expensive renovation in a neighborhood that had gentrified around it. Dominic's sanctuary. Vincent pulled to the curb, came around to open Grace's door. She climbed out carefully, knees protesting. Dominic's coat hung heavy on her shoulders. Inside the brownstone was exactly as Grace remembered. Clean lines, expensive but understated furniture, everything in its place. This was where Dominic came when he needed to be more than the man people feared, where he could be a father to Violet, where he could be a brother. He guided her to the couch, disappeared into what she knew was a fully stocked medical closet, returned with a proper first aid kit, bottled water, clean towels. He knelt in front of her for the second time that night, carefully began unwrapping gauze he'd applied at the Velvet Rose. This might sting, he warned before applying fresh antiseptic. It did sting. Grace bit her lip and stayed still, watched her brother work with the same careful precision, checking for remaining glass, cleaning cuts thoroughly, applying antibiotic ointment before rewrapping with clean gauze. "You've gotten better at this," Grace observed. "Practice." Dominic said it without elaborating. They both knew what that meant. His world required frequent medical attention that couldn't always involve hospitals and questions. When he finished, Dominic sat back, studied her face. "When did we stop talking, Gracie?" The question caught her off guard. "We still talk." "No. We exchange information, weather, work, surface updates, but we stopped talking. Really talking, the way we used to." Grace looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together. "After you took over Dad's business. After you became—" She gestured vaguely. "This—" Dominic's expression shifted. Understanding and hurt in equal measure. "You mean after I became someone who scared you?" "Not scared of you," Grace said quickly. "Never scared of you. Scared for you, and scared of what being your sister meant." She took a breath. "Everyone looked at me differently once your reputation grew. Like I was dangerous by association, like I came with threats attached. I just wanted to be Grace, not Grace Donnelly, not your sister, just me." Dominic stood, moved to sit beside her on the couch, careful not to jostle her injured legs. "I never wanted that for you," he said. "I know, but it happened anyway." Grace pulled his coat tighter. "Do you remember when we were kids before everything got bad with Dad? I remember. You used to walk me to school every morning, carried my backpack even though yours was heavier. Made sure I ate breakfast even when there wasn't much food." Dominic's jaw tightened at the memories. Someone had to. "You were 12, Grace said, voice cracking. 12 years old and already playing parent because ours couldn't. And then you got older and Dad got worse and you had to make choices no teenager should make. Had to become hard to survive. I did what I had to do." "I know, and I'm grateful." Grace turned to look at him. "But Dom, you sacrificed your softness to keep us safe, and somewhere along the way I think you forgot you were allowed to be anything other than dangerous." Dominic was quiet, staring at his hands, the same hands that had just tenderly cleaned her wounds, the same hands that had built an empire on controlled power. "I didn't forget," he said finally. "I just couldn't afford to be soft outside these walls. The world I operate in doesn't reward gentleness." "But you were gentle tonight," Grace said. "At the Velvet Rose. You knelt beside me and cleaned glass off the floor and held me like I mattered more than your reputation. You do matter more than my reputation." Dominic's voice was rough. "You always have. Then why does it feel like we're strangers pretending to be family?" The words hung between them, raw and honest and painful. "Because you pulled away," Dominic said quietly. "And I let you, because I thought that's what you needed, distance from me, from what I am, from the consequences of being related to someone like me." "I pulled away because I didn't want to be a liability," Grace said. "Didn't want you making choices based on protecting me instead of what was right for you." "Gracie," Dominic turned to face her fully. "You're not a liability. You're the reason I make the choices I make, everything I built, every move I've made. It's so you could have options I never had, safety I never felt, freedom to choose your own path, even when my path led me to the velvet rose," Grace said. "To men who thought they could humiliate me because I was nobody." Dominic's expression hardened. "You were never nobody. Not to me." And those men learned tonight what happens when people forget that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. Grace leaned her head against her brother's shoulder, exhaustion finally winning over pride. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to stay away. I'm sorry I let you believe you had to survive alone." They sat like that in the quiet brownstone. Two people who'd survived the same childhood in different ways, finally remembering why they'd fought so hard to protect each other in the first place. Outside Chicago continued its endless motion, but inside for the first time in months, Grace felt something like safety, like home. Her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, saw Julian's name, a text message. "Grace, I'm so sorry. I should have helped. Are you okay?" She stared at the words, typed back, "I'm okay, thank you for the first aid kit." 3 dots appeared, then, "There's more. You should check social media." Thad posted something. Grace's stomach dropped. She opened Twitter, searched Thaddeus Blackwood. The post was 2 hours old, already had 5,000 shares, and "Tonight I was threatened and intimidated by a violent individual at the Velvet Rose. After a simple misunderstanding with service staff, this person entered the establishment and made direct threats against myself and my colleagues. I am currently consulting with my legal team regarding assault, intimidation, and unlawful interference with business relationships." The post included video, 23 seconds, carefully edited to show only Dominic entering, face set in an expression that could be read as threatening. Shows him standing over the 3 men, shows them backing away, clearly frightened. What the video doesn't show Grace on the floor: the broken glass, the blood, the 70 witnesses, the context that would make Dominic's arrival look like rescue instead of assault. The comments section had exploded. 2,300 replies, some supportive, many suspicious, a few calling for Dominic's arrest. Grace's hands started shaking. "Dom," she said, voice tight. He was already reading over her shoulder. She felt him go very still, that dangerous stillness that preceded calculated action. "This is my fault," Grace said. "I dragged you into this and now he's no." Dominic's voice cut through her spiral. "He's escalating because he knows he lost. Desperate people make noise." "What are you going to do?" Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, walked to the window, looked out at Chicago's nighttime skyline. When he spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. "What I do best, control the narrative." "Dom, but not me." He turned to face her. "You." Grace stared at him. "What, they filmed you, Gracie, without your consent, humiliated you for entertainment. Thad just posted a lie on a public platform where it's already spreading. So we respond, but with the truth, your voice, your face." "I can't," Grace started. "You can," Dominic said gently. "You're the strongest person I know, and unlike Thad, you have something he doesn't." "What, the truth? And 70 witnesses who saw it?" Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat in Dominic's study while he made phone calls to lawyers and media contacts and people whose names she didn't recognize but whose tones suggested they took his requests seriously. She drafted her statement, deleted it, started over, deleted again. How do you condense 3 months of harassment, 1 night of humiliation, a lifetime of learning to stay silent into words that would make strangers understand? At 3 in the morning, Dominic brought her coffee, sat down across from her. "Tell me what you want to say," he said. Grace looked at the blank screen. "I want to say that I'm tired. Tired of being scared, tired of enduring, tired of people like Thad thinking they can treat people like me as less than human." "Then say that. What if no one believes me?" "Some won't," Dominic said honestly. "Some will call you a liar, a gold digger, worse." "But Gracie, You're not doing this for them. You're doing it for every other server who's been humiliated and stayed silent because they needed the job. You're doing it so the next woman doesn't have to kneel. Grace started typing. This time she didn't delete. By dawn she had her statement. 400 words, simple, honest, devastating in its restraint. Julian called at 6 a.m. Voice rushed, excited, guilty. Grace, the Velvet Rose security footage. I have access, full cameras, everything. Do you want it? Grace looked at Dominic. He nodded once. Yes, she said. Send it. At 7:30, after Dominic's lawyers reviewed everything and confirmed she understood the risks, Grace Donnelly posted her statement to Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. She included her full name, her face, and 18 seconds of unedited security footage that showed Thad kicking her knee, her falling the glass, the blood, the laughter. She titled it, "My name is Grace Donnelly. 3 months ago, this happened to me." Then she waited. The response came faster than she'd imagined possible. 10 shares in the first minute, 100 in 5 minutes, 1,020. By 9 a.m., 50,000 views. By noon, 200,000. Major news outlets picked it up. Iowa's Grace 2 started trending. Women across the country sharing their own stories of harassment in service industry jobs. Stories locked away for years because speaking up meant losing income, facing retaliation, being told they were too sensitive. Grace's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from strangers, reporters requesting interviews, threats from Thad's defenders, support from women who saw themselves in her story. She turned off her phone, sat in Dominic's brownstone trying to process what she'd unleashed. "I made it worse," she said to the empty room. "I shouldn't have posted. I should have stayed quiet." That's when she heard small footsteps on the stairs. Violet appeared in the doorway. 4 years old, dark curls like her father, enormous eyes that had seen too much sadness. She wore pajamas with cartoon characters and carried a stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her mother. The little girl hadn't eaten properly since her mother died. Dominic had tried everything. Pediatricians, therapists, different foods, nothing worked. Violet would pick at meals, push food around her plate, eventually give up. Too thin, too quiet. Lost in grief, she was too young to articulate. She walked up to Grace slowly, studied her with those serious eyes. "Why are you crying?" Violet asked. Grace hadn't realized she was. She wiped her cheeks quickly. "Sometimes brave people still feel scared." Violet tilted her head. "Considered this. Daddy says Mommy was brave. She's not here anymore." Grace's throat tightened. "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry." Was she brave when the bad thing happened? Grace didn't know the details of how Dominic's wife had died, only that it was violent, that Dominic blamed himself, that Violet had been in the car but somehow survived. "Yes," Grace said quietly, "she was very brave." Violet climbed onto the couch beside Grace, set her rabbit down carefully. Being brave doesn't stop bad things from happening. No, Grace admitted. It doesn't. Being brave just means you survive them, and you keep going even when you're scared. Violet was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm hungry." Grace blinked, looked down at the small face turned up toward hers. "You are," Violet nodded. "Will you make me breakfast?" It was such a simple request, but Dominic appeared in the doorway looking like he might cry. He'd been standing there listening, had heard his daughter say words she hadn't said in nearly 2 years. Grace stood carefully. Her knees still hurt, but she could manage. "What would you like?" "Pancakes," Violet said. "Then softer. Mommy used to make them with chocolate chips." Grace made pancakes. Dominic stood in the kitchen doorway watching his daughter eat. Actually eat. Finishing almost the entire plate while she told Grace about her stuffed rabbit and her favorite cartoon and how she was learning to read. When Violet finished, she looked up at Grace with syrup on her chin. "Thank you, Auntie Grace, Auntie Grace." The words hit like a physical blow. Grace knelt down despite the pain in her knees, pulled Violet into a hug. The little girl wrapped her arms around Grace's neck and held on tight. Over Violet's head, Grace met Dominic's eyes. He was crying silently. His daughter was eating. His daughter was talking. His daughter was healing. Later, after Violet had been coaxed into a nap, Dominic found Grace in the study. She was reading through comments on her post, most supportive now. The ugliest ones had been reported and removed. "Thank you," Dominic said. "For what?" "For reminding her she's allowed to be hungry, to need things, to ask for help." He sat down heavily. "I've been trying for 2 years, and you did it in 5 minutes. I didn't do anything special." "You told her the truth," Dominic said, "that being brave doesn't stop bad things. It just means you survived them." She needed to hear that. Grace's phone buzzed. She turned it back on. Julian's name appeared. "Grace, there's a meeting at the Velvet Rose. Corporate sent someone. They want to talk to all the staff about what happened. Will you come?" Grace looked at Dominic. He nodded. "I'll drive you," he said, "but I'll wait outside. This is yours." The Velvet Rose looked different in daylight, less polished, more exposed. The amber lighting that hid cruelties couldn't compete with sun streaming through tinted windows. Staff had gathered in the main dining area. Servers Grace recognized, bartenders including Julian, who gave her a small, guilty wave. Kitchen workers in their whites, management hovering nervously, and at the center stood a woman in her mid-40s, sharp suit, kind eyes, graying hair pulled back in a style that suggested competence. "I'm Margaret Sinclair," she said when the room settled. "Regional Director, and I'm here because this establishment failed its employee, failed basic human decency, failed every value we claim to hold." She gestured toward Grace, who'd slipped in quietly and taken a seat near the back. Several staff members turned. Some faces showed shame, others relief that Grace had survived. A few showed the complicated expression of people who'd wanted to help but hadn't. "Many of you witnessed what happened Friday night," Margaret continued. "A server was physically assaulted by customers while working her shift. She was harmed, humiliated, and according to multiple accounts, 70 people watched it happen." The room shifted uncomfortably, guilt thick enough to taste. "This isn't about blame," Margaret said. "This is about accountability and change. Mr. Pemberton is no longer with this company. Effective immediately, we're implementing new protocols." She outlined them systematically. Anonymous reporting system, mandatory intervention training, management empowered to remove abusive customers without corporate approval, security staff trained to recognize escalating situations. "But policies mean nothing without culture change," Margaret said. "So I'm asking each of you, what would have made a difference Friday night? What needs to shift so that next time, and there will be a next time, someone crosses a line, we respond differently?" Silence held for several seconds. Then Julian stood, voice shaking but steady. "We need to know we won't get fired for defending each other." "Agreed," Margaret said immediately. "Documented and guaranteed." A younger server raised her hand. "Can we refuse to serve people who've been inappropriate before without getting in trouble?" "Yes. We're creating a shared database of banned patrons. If someone makes you uncomfortable, they don't get service." "Period." Another voice. "What about retaliation, bad reviews, complaints to management?" "We handle it," Margaret said firmly. "You protect each other. We protect you. That's the new standard." Grace had been sitting quietly, but now she stood. The room turned to look. She saw recognition on many faces. Some had seen the viral video. Others had been there Friday night. All of them knew who she was now. "I'm not coming back to work here," Grace said. Her voice came out stronger than she'd expected. "But I wanted you all to know something." She took a breath. "Friday night, I felt completely alone. I thought survival meant enduring whatever came my way silently. I was wrong." She looked around at the faces watching. Colleagues who'd frozen, management who'd failed, an entire ecosystem that had chosen comfort over intervention. "You don't have to be alone. None of us do. What happened to me could happen to any of you. And when it does, when someone crosses a line, when you feel unsafe, when you need help, I hope you'll speak up. I hope you'll intervene for each other, because nobody should have to kneel on broken glass while a room full of people watches." Julian started the standing ovation. Within seconds, the entire staff was on their feet. Not applauding, just standing in silent solidarity that said, "We hear you, we see you, we'll do better." After the meeting ended, 3 people approached Grace together. Sarah Blackwood, the businesswoman who'd been sitting near the bar Friday night, and the Whitakers, the elderly couple who'd left without helping. Mrs. Whitaker spoke first, voice shaking. "We saw everything, we did nothing, we just left, walked right past you." Her husband held her arm, supporting her. 15 years coming to the Velvet Rose, we always thought we were good people. But Friday night we chose our comfort over your safety." Sarah stepped forward. "I recorded it on my phone, watched through the screen instead of putting the phone down and helping. I deleted it immediately after, out of shame, not solidarity." She paused. "If you need it for legal proceedings, I can try to recover it. But I needed to tell you I was a coward when it mattered." Grace looked at the 3 of them. Different ages, different backgrounds, united by the same shame. "We can't undo our inaction," Mr. Whitaker said. "But we want to do something now. We have full video from our table." He held up a phone with shaking hands. "Our grandson was teaching us to use this. The camera was still running during everything. Unedited. Complete." Grace felt her throat tighten. These people could have stayed home, could have pretended Friday night never happened. Instead, they'd come here to apologize and offer help. "I don't blame you," Grace said quietly. "Any of you. I blame myself. Thought enduring was strength. We were all wrong." She looked at Sarah. "You're here now. You can do better next time. We all can." Mrs. Whitaker was crying. "We want to help. Fund your organization. Whatever it takes," and they did. The Whitakers became major donors. Sarah resigned from her marketing job to work full-time as director of witness advocacy, teaching bystanders how to intervene. Mr. Whitaker's phone footage became the evidence that made settlement negotiations possible. Sometimes Grace thought redemption looks like showing up late and staying forever. The lawsuit was filed Monday morning. Grace Donnelly versus Thaddeus Blackwood, Montgomery, Ashford, Preston Vale, and the Velvet Rose corporate entity. Charges: assault, battery, creating hostile work environment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Dominic had wanted her to pursue criminal charges as well, but Grace chose differently. "I don't want them in jail," she told him Sunday night. "I want public accountability. I want the truth on record. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The lawsuit made national news within hours. Grace's viral video had already primed the audience. Now the legal filing provided documentation, names, specific charges. The Whitakers' unedited footage showing full context that Thad's edited version had omitted. Thad deleted his LinkedIn post. Too late. Screenshots had spread everywhere. His employer released a carefully worded statement about not commenting on ongoing legal matters. Montgomery's investment firm put him on administrative leave. Preston's hedge fund clients started asking uncomfortable questions. By Wednesday, all 3 men had retained lawyers. By Friday, those lawyers had watched the full security footage and the Whitakers' video and read witness statements from 70 people who'd been at the Velvet Rose that night. Emily Brennan, Thad's attorney, called Grace's legal team on Saturday morning. "My client would like to discuss settlement." The negotiation took 3 weeks. Grace's lawyers pushed for trial, criminal prosecution, maximum penalties. But Grace held firm on what she wanted. Not their money, not their destruction, accountability and change. The final settlement terms were unconventional. One public written apology from all 3 men, published in the Chicago Tribune, Wall Street Journal, and posted on their professional social media. Unambiguous admission of wrongdoing. No hedging, no excuses. $500,000 paid. To establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to workplace safety in the service industry. Grace would serve as executive director. All three men banned from the Velvet Rose and 53 other establishments in Chicago that had signed onto Margaret Sinclair's new shared database of prohibited patrons. 4 agreement not to pursue countersuits, file complaints against Dominic, or retaliate against Grace in any form. 5 mandatory completion of harassment prevention training certified by an independent organization. Dominic read the terms and shook his head. You could destroy them in court. Take everything. Why settle? Grace looked at her brother. Because I don't need to destroy them. I need to prevent the next me. This way we build something that lasts. Something that helps people. Isn't that better than revenge? Dominic was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. You're better than I ever was, Gracie. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday. The apologies were published that Friday in full-page ads in the Chicago Tribune and Wall Street Journal. Thaddeus Blackwood's statement ran under his professional headshot. On the evening of March 15th, I physically assaulted Grace Donnelly while she was working at the Velvet Rose. I kicked her, causing her to fall onto broken glass. I filmed her injuries for my entertainment. I laughed while she bled. There is no excuse for my actions, no context that makes them acceptable. I caused deliberate harm to another human being because I believed my wealth and status made me untouchable. I was wrong. I am profoundly sorry. I am committed to ensuring this never happens again by me or anyone else. Montgomery Ashford's and Preston Vale's statements were similarly unambiguous. No hedging, no mistakes were made, passive voice. No if anyone was offended qualifiers. Just clear admission of wrongdoing. Grace read Thad's statement 3 times in the Tribune's morning edition. Her coffee grew cold as she stared at the words. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. But it was something. He actually admitted it, Hazel said, reading over her shoulder. In public, where everyone can see. Hazel had gotten early acceptance to Northwestern 2 weeks after Grace's story went viral. Apparently, several admissions officers had daughters working service jobs, and the full scholarship that came with it meant Grace's years of sacrifice had actually led somewhere. Yes, Grace said quietly. He did, and that mattered. Because the next man who thought about kicking a server would remember these full-page apologies. The next witness who thought about staying silent would remember what silence protected. The next woman on her knees would know she had the right to stand up and demand accountability. Words on paper couldn't heal Grace's wounds, but they could prevent someone else's. The consequences unfolded over the following months in ways both public and private. Thaddeus lost his position at the real estate firm 2 days after the apologies published. Mutual decision to part ways, the press release said. His engagement was called off the same week his fiancée's family had service industry investments and didn't appreciate the association. Grace saw him once 3 months later across the street from a restaurant he used to frequent. He started to approach the entrance, saw the host checking the banned patron database on a tablet, and turned away. His shoulders hunched in a way that suggested the weight of reputation rebuilt on shame rather than fear. Montgomery Ashford's luxury car dealership lost its primary financing partners within a month. His clients, wealthy families who valued discretion, quietly took their business elsewhere. He moved to Phoenix, where Google searches of his name still surfaced the apology. He'd told friends he was starting fresh. His new employer fired him after week 2 when a server recognized his face and quietly showed the manager the Tribune article on her phone. Preston Vale faced the harshest consequences. The SEC investigation that Dominic had triggered with an anonymous tip uncovered fraud unrelated to Grace's case. Federal charges, assets frozen, his face on the news for weeks, but this time as a white-collar criminal, not a victim of intimidation. His lawyer tried to argue the investigation was retaliatory. The judge reviewed the evidence, emails, transactions, testimony from 4 witnesses who'd been waiting for someone to ask the right questions, and disagreed. Preston was sentenced to 6 years, no early release. None of it brought Grace satisfaction exactly. She'd meant what she told Dominic. She didn't need to destroy them. But watching accountability unfold, watching privilege fail to protect them from consequences, watching the system work for once, that mattered. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was something. 3 months later, Grace stood in a small office in a renovated building on Chicago's South Side. The sign on the door read, "Safe Service Initiative," in clean professional letters. Inside, 5 staff members worked at desks, answering calls from service industry workers reporting harassment, coordinating legal resources, scheduling training sessions for restaurants and bars. Building the infrastructure to ensure what happened to Grace wouldn't happen unchecked to others. Julian had left bartending to become director of training, his Northwestern English degree finally useful for something meaningful. He developed curricula teaching servers to recognize escalation, set boundaries, report safely. The Whitakers had provided additional funding beyond the settlement. Enough to hire staff, rent office space, build a real organization. Mrs. Whitaker volunteered 3 days a week answering phones, offering grandmother wisdom to young workers who'd been gaslit into thinking harassment was normal. Sarah Blackwood had thrown herself into the work with the intensity of someone trying to earn redemption, one intervention at a time. She trained witnesses, taught them the difference between watching and seeing, between discomfort and action. Her sessions were always full. In 3 months, they'd received 2,400 reports. 89% had resulted in some form of action. Harassers fired, management held accountable, policies changed, lives improved. Grace had found her purpose in the wreckage of her humiliation. Her relationship with Dominic had healed, not repaired because it had never truly been broken, just recalibrated. They had dinner every Sunday now. Grace, Dominic, Violet, and Hazel, who lit up Northwestern's campus with the kind of brilliance that came from surviving circumstances that should have crushed her. Violet called Grace Auntie Gracie and told anyone who'd listen that Grace made the best pancakes in Chicago. The little girl was eating normally now, laughing more, still sad sometimes, which was natural and healthy, but no longer trapped in that frozen grief that had stolen 2 years of her childhood. "You gave her permission to be hungry," Dominic had said last Sunday over pasta he'd cooked himself, a skill Grace hadn't known he possessed. "To need things, to ask for help. Thank you." "I didn't do anything special," Grace had replied. "You lived through something terrible and chose to build something beautiful. That's everything." Now, on a Tuesday in late June, Grace Donnelly stood in a hotel conference room facing 200 people. Service industry workers from 43 states who'd come to Chicago for the Safe Service Initiative annual conference. The banner behind her read the organization's name in letters tall enough to read from the back row. Grace gripped the podium, looked out at faces that reflected her own story back at her. Young and old, every background. Men and women who'd learned that survival in service work meant swallowing indignity with a smile. She took a breath, let it out slowly. 3 months ago she began, "I was on my knees. Today I'm standing. Let me tell you why that matters." The room went silent, not the uncomfortable silence of people checking phones or whispering to neighbors, but the kind of silence that meant every person was leaning forward, waiting. And Grace told them everything. Told them about the velvet rose and the 3 men who'd made humiliation into entertainment. Told them about the 70 witnesses who'd watched and done nothing. And then told them about the witnesses who'd found their courage after who'd chosen redemption over comfort, who'd become the organization's strongest advocates. Told them about her brother who'd shown up when everything fell apart and taught her that asking for help wasn't weakness. Told them about going viral, about the hatred and the support and the overwhelming realization that she wasn't alone, that thousands of women carried similar stories locked away in shame. Told them about choosing accountability over revenge, about building something instead of just tearing down. "I don't blame the witnesses who stayed silent," Grace said. "I was one of you. I watched other servers get harassed and told myself it wasn't my business. We're all taught to stay quiet, to endure, to not make waves." She paused, let the words settle. "But silence protects predators. Speaking up protects people. The screen behind her lit up. Statistics since #I was Grace 2 went viral. 2,400 workers had filed harassment reports. 89% resulted in action. Policy changes implemented in over 300 establishments across 20 states. A national conversation about safety and service work that showed no signs of stopping. Bruises heal in weeks, Grace continued, her voice steady. But the change we've built together, the voices we've found, the courage we've shared, those last forever. She could see Dominic in the audience, Violet on his lap, patient and quiet, already learning that showing up mattered. Hazel beside them, taking notes for a sociology project about grassroots movements. The Whitakers in the front row, hands clasped together, tears streaming down faces that had learned shame could be transformed into purpose. Julian managing the conference crowd with the efficiency of someone who'd found his calling. Margaret Sinclair on the panel representing corporate commitment to real change. Sarah Blackwood coordinating with reporters who'd come to cover the event, no longer running from cameras but running toward the chance to tell this story right. All the people who'd failed and learned, who'd been complicit and chose different, who'd stayed silent and found their voices. Real strength, Grace said, her voice carrying to the back of the room, isn't surviving alone. It's knowing who has your back and being brave enough to ask for help when you need it, being strong enough to offer help when others need you. She looked at the crowd, saw women crying, saw men nodding, saw recognition in every face. Saw the future they were building together, one conversation, one intervention, one moment of courage at a time. You're not alone, Grace said. None of us are, and together we're changing what service work looks like. Making it safer, making it better, making sure the next server who faces harassment knows they have options. Resources, support, a voice that can't be silenced by threats or money or fear. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Grace stood at the podium and let it wash over her, let herself feel it. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate. The journey from kneeling on broken glass to standing before 200 people who'd come because they believed change was possible. That night, after the conference ended and the crowd dispersed, Grace sat with Dominic on the brownstone's front steps. Violet had fallen asleep during the car ride home, her small hand still clutching Grace's fingers. Hazel was inside doing homework with the focused intensity of someone who knew education was the bridge between where she'd been and where she was going. The city hummed around them in comfortable summer darkness. I'm proud of you, Dominic said. For what? For turning the worst night of your life into something that helps thousands of people. For being braver than I ever was. Grace leaned her head against her brother's shoulder. You were brave first. You taught me what protection looks like, what family means, what showing up requires. They sat in comfortable silence. Brother and sister, protector and protected, but also equals now, partners in building something better than what they'd survived. Dom, Grace said quietly. Yeah, thank you for showing up. That night, every night since, for not letting me stay on my knees. Dominic wrapped his arm around her shoulders. You wouldn't have stayed down, Gracie. You never do. I just made sure you didn't have to stand alone. Inside, Violet stirred. Called out for her father in that small voice that still sometimes woke from nightmares but now also woke asking for pancakes and stories and Auntie Grace. Dominic stood, offered Grace his hand. Pulled her up. They went inside together, into the brownstone that had become home for all of them. Into the safety they'd built from broken glass and blood and tears, and the absolute refusal to let cruelty have the final word. Grace Donnelly had knelt on the floor of the Velvet Rose 3 months ago, bleeding, humiliated, believing she was alone. Today she stood, surrounded by people who'd failed and chosen better, who'd stayed silent and found their voices, who'd watched from distance and decided proximity mattered more than safety. The scars on her knees had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. unless you understood that survival left marks that never fully disappeared but could be transformed into something that looked almost like strength. But the organization she'd built, the lives she'd changed and would continue changing, the witnesses she'd transformed into advocates, the culture she was helping to shift, one training session, one policy change, one moment of intervention at a time. Those were permanent. Real strength isn't surviving alone, it's knowing when to stand together. Grace Donnelly had learned that lesson on broken glass and tears and the 70 witnesses who taught her through their slants that she never wanted anyone else to feel that alone. Now she was teaching it to thousands. And together they were changing everything. Back in the downtown Chicago office, Grace Donnelly picked up the pen. Patricia Wu watched across the mahogany desk as Grace signed her name on the settlement agreement. One signature, then another, then a third on the final page. "Done," Patricia said quietly. "It's official." Grace set down the pen, looked at her lawyer. "What happens now?" Patricia smiled. "Now you build. The nonprofit, the training programs, the database, the future where servers don't have to choose between dignity and a paycheck." Grace stood, walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looked down at Chicago stretching beneath her. Somewhere down there, the Velvet Rose was serving lunch. Somewhere down there, a server was dealing with a difficult customer and making the calculation about whether to speak up or stay silent. Somewhere down there, the next Grace Donnelly was deciding whether she was strong enough to ask for help. And now, because Grace had chosen to stand up after being forced to kneel, that next woman would have options, would have resources, would have a phone number to call and a website to visit, and the knowledge that 70 witnesses who'd stayed silent once had transformed their shame into action. Grace turned from the window. "Thank you," she said to Patricia, "for everything." Patricia stood, extended her hand for a shake. "Thank you for trusting the system when you had every reason not to, for choosing accountability over revenge, for showing us all what real strength looks like." They shook. Grace gathered her copies of the settlement agreement, took the elevator down 52 floors to ground level where Dominic was waiting with the car. "How'd it go?" he asked as she slid into the back seat. "It's done," Grace said. "We won." Dominic smiled. Started to say something, stopped when he saw the expression on Grace's face. What he asked. Grace looked at her brother, at the man who'd knelt beside her on broken glass and shown her that power was a choice, and protection was a gift, and family was the people who showed up when everything fell apart. "I was just thinking," she said, "about that night, about everything that's happened since, about how the worst moment of my life became the thing that gave me purpose." She paused, looked out the window at Chicago moving past. "I wouldn't choose to go through it again. But I also wouldn't undo it, because of everything it led to. Everyone it's helped, everything it taught me about strength and vulnerability and the courage it takes to ask for help." Dominic reached over, took her hand, squeezed once. "That's healing," he said quietly, "when you can hold both truths at the same time, that it was terrible, and that something beautiful grew from it anyway." Grace squeezed back, held on, and together they drove home.